This presentation is Genetic Adaptations to Extreme Environments in Sports Performance. It's presented by Tiffany Mai, Peyton Malashi, and Victoria Wang. Preface is included because it sets the tone for this presentation and it explains why studying naturally occurring adaptations is highly relevant to sports, military, as well as others who subject themselves to extreme conditions. Studying natural biological phenomenons in the animal kingdom has been the foundation for innovation in technological inventions. In engineering, this concept is known as biomimicry. An example is when scientists and engineers, they study the natural anatomy of the peregrine falcon, as well as its diving behavior to design the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. This same concept has been integrated to enhance sports performance and military training. Today, we are looking at specific ethnic groups like high-altitude dwellers, desert nomads, and aquatic populations as they offer insight into enhanced oxygen utilization, energy efficiency, thermoregulation, and fatigue resistance. We're briefly going to be discussing the background and history of each ethnic group, as well as the physiological phenotypes they possess. Then we will discuss the phenotypes that are associated with these specific genes and how strong the evidence is. Then we'll touch on which innovative sport and military technologies are tailored to elicit similar phenotypic adaptations as these ethnic groups. And lastly, we'll discuss how studying extreme environment adaptations pushes the boundary of human activity on untouched lands. Okay, we're going to start out with discussing high altitude adapted ethnic groups. And we're going to start out by talking about the Sherpa ethnic group. The Sherpas are primarily located in the Sulu Khumbu district, which is located in East Nepal, which is the same district that Mount Everest is located in. This ethnic group is originally from Tibet, but they traveled to Nepal between the 12th and 16th century. This ethnic group currently resides in elevations between 2,400 and 3,600 meters. The three most important adaptations found through research were the adaptations to high altitude hypoxia, increased mitochondrial efficiency, and increased nitric oxide production. It's interesting that this population has lower hemoglobin levels than one would expect. And instead, the oxygen is delivered very efficiently and it's utilized very efficiently. They also have increased mitochondrial efficiency because they have higher ATP production per unit of oxygen consumed. And lastly, increased nitric oxide production leads to increased vasodilation of the blood vessels, which ultimately leads to improved oxygen delivery. The gene connected the high altitude hypoxia adaptation is the EPAS1 gene variant. This gene is considered to be the master regulator of adaptations related to high altitude hypoxia. This variant in the Sherpas signals for efficient O2 transport and advantageous cell adaptations. The EGLN1 gene is closely related to increased nitric oxide production via the HIF cascade, which upregulates in hypoxic conditions and incites angiogenesis. One thing that I thought was really interesting to note is that this ethnic group is one of the strongest examples of natural selection in humans. Moving on to the Quechua ethnic group. This ethnic group is located in the Andes Mountains of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, and they reside in elevations between 3,000 and 4,500 meters. Their roots date back thousands of years before the Inca Empire, and they are said to have built extensive road networks in these altitudes. The three functional adaptations I decided were most relevant for this population are the high altitude hypoxia adaptation, increased lung capacity, and enhanced oxygen delivery. This group has higher hemoglobin concentrations and hematocrit levels, but it comes at a trade-off, as described below. The Quechua phenotype increases oxygen carrying capacity through elevated hemoglobin concentration, but it comes at the expense of having increased blood viscosity, which can negatively impact cardiovascular health. Moving on to increased lung capacity. Increased lung capacity means that more oxygen is entering the system per breath. And lastly, increased oxygen delivery is linked to increased nitric oxide production. And in the Quechua, the EPAS1 gene variant, which is the master regulator of hypoxic responses, as mentioned earlier, is linked to the increased hemoglobin levels seen in the Quechua. The NOS2 and the NOS3 gene promote vasodilation by encoding for an enzyme that produces nitric oxide. And lastly, the VEGF gene controls for blood vessel formation. Together, these genes function to enhance oxygen delivery to the tissues. And last, we're going to talk about the Tarahumara ethnic group. The Tarahumara ethnic group is located in the Copper Canyon of the northern region of Mexico, and they call themselves Rarámuri, which means those who run fast. They reside in elevations between 1,500 and 2,400 meters. They're descendants of ancient indigenous groups, and their geographical isolation has been a really big factor in maintaining their lifestyle that they have. Incredible endurance, efficient running mechanics, low body composition, and efficient metabolism are all functional adaptations seen in this ethnic group. A high aerobic capacity is associated with increased endurance. A midfoot strike is associated with increased mechanical efficiency. Efficient fat and carb oxidation is associated with their efficient metabolism. And lastly, their low body fat composition leads to decreased energy costs. The strength, however, of the genetic evidence is weak as of right now. And at the moment, there are no genetic markers associated with the Tarahumara endurance phenotype. But it is likely that these are complex polygenic traits. And it's evident that their physiological adaptations that they hold are strongly reinforced by their behavioral and their cultural patterns. So at this time, the only thing that we can do is guess which alleles they possess that help to enhance these phenotypes that they do present. So it could be the ACE-I allele. It could be the actin 3X allele, could be the AMPD1 gene, it could be due to the VEGF A gene, the EPORA gene, the nitric oxide gene. So a lot of this is speculative. And now we're moving on to marine adapted ethnic groups. We're going to be discussing the Bajau ethnic group. The Bajau are located in parts of Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. They originated over 1,000 years ago and are known as the sea nomads of the Sulu archipelago. There are oral stories mentioning them as seafaring fishers and traders, and the most skilled Bajau are known to dive between 20 and 40 meters. The three adaptations and phenotypes I decided to include are the underwater hypoxia adaptation, the enlarged spleen adaptation, and acute vasoconstriction. The underwater hypoxia adaptation is tied to having an adaptive response to acute hypoxia, which is a special inherent diving reflex. An interesting thing is that their spleen size is up to 50% larger than average, and their spleen releases oxygen-rich blood into circulation while diving, which leads to a temporary increase in oxygen availability. And the gene connected to their spleen size is the PDE10A gene, which encodes for an enzyme that converts cyclic AMP into cyclic GMP. This is linked to thyroid hormone regulation and the size of their spleen. And the other gene is the BDKRB2 gene. And this gene encodes for the bradykinin receptor involved in vasodilation. And this leads to blood pressure regulation and increased vascular permeability. And one cool thing to note in this population is that it's this ethnic group is a really great example of marine-based genetic adaptations in humans. Okay, we're moving on to the desert-adapted ethnic groups, and we're going to be discussing the Bedouin and the Tuareg ethnic groups. And I've lumped them together. The Bedouin originate from the Arabian Peninsula, and the Tuareg originate in the Sahara Desert. The Bedouin comes from the Arabic word Badawi, and they have incredible survival skills, including a deep understanding of water resources. The Tuareg on the other hand, are descendants of the Berbers in North Africa, and they were considered to be lords of the desert, playing an integral key role in sub-Saharan trade. The phenotypes associated with these two groups include efficient thermoregulation, sweat efficiency, electrolyte conservation, and enhanced water retention. The efficient thermoregulation leads to a lower rise of core body temperature during intense heat exposure. The sweat efficiency leads to minimization of fluid loss. The electrolyte conservation leads to reduced sodium loss, which prevents muscle cramping and heat-related illness. And lastly, the enhanced water retention is a result of having efficient kidney function. And as of right now, the strength of the genetic evidence is weak or it's emerging. And there are no known genetic markers associated with the Bedouin and the Tuareg. And it's just likely that these phenotypes are polygenic. And it's also likely that the environmental adaptations are strongly reinforced by their behavior and their culture. So as of now, we can only propose candidate genes, and the candidate genes that are proposed are below, which include the HSP70 gene, which encodes for heat shock proteins, the TRPV1 gene, which is involved in thermoregulatory signaling, the SLC12A3 gene, which prevents excessive sodium loss, and the NOS3 nitric oxide gene, which is involved in heat dissipation through vasodilation.
Before getting into the science of military adaptation to extreme environments, I wanted to frame why this topic actually matters. Modern military operations require rapid global deployment, often in extreme environments like high altitude, extreme cold, or severe heat. The challenge that is the human body is not immediately equipped to perform in these conditions, and there's often no time for natural acclimatization. This creates a direct operational risk where both physical and cognitive performance can decline right when performance matters the most. So the central question for this presentation is, how can the military rapidly adapt human physiology to environments that it isn't naturally prepared for? By the end of my part of this presentation, there will be 5 main things to understand and go over. First, the primary strategies that the military uses to adapt to environmental stressors. Second, the physiological responses to hypoxia and extreme climates. Third, how these strategies perform into the real-world joint training forces. Fourth, the limitations of short-term adaptations. And fifth, how genetics will influence the variability in performance. Why artificial adaptation? At the core of this issue is a mismatch between operational timelines and human physiology. Natural acclimatization takes days, if not weeks, but deployments often happen immediately. As results, soldiers experience reduced oxygen uptake, decreased endurance, and faster fatigue. At the same time, the risk of altitude sickness, heat injury, and cold-related injuries increases significantly. Because natural adaptation is too slow, the military focuses on alternating physiological responses. The goal is to maintain performance immediately by improving oxygen delivery, cardiovascular efficiency, and respiratory response in a much shorter time frame. Intermittent hypoxia exposure is one of the most advanced tools in modern military physiology. Rather than deploying to high altitudes, soldiers are cycled through low oxygen environments using hypoxic chambers or breathing systems. This controlled stress activates the body's oxygen sensing mechanisms, increasing EPO production and driving red blood cell synthesis. The result is improved oxygen transportation, enhanced endurance, and a greater resilience under stress without the cost of relocation. IHE essentially compresses weeks of environmental stressors into targeted training sessions. Simulated altitude trainings, also called normobaric hypoxia, pushes this concept even further. By reducing oxygen concentration while maintaining normal atmospheric pressure, it replicates high-altitude conditions in a controlled setting. This allows for precise dosing of hypoxic stress, repeatable training cycles, and integration with physical conditioning. It is scalable, efficient, and increasingly central to elite military and special operations preparation. Gradual acclimatization. Despite our technological advances, gradual acclimatization remains the most complete form of adaptation. Over 2 or 3 weeks, the body undergoes a systemic change, increased ventilation, elevated cardiac output, higher hemocentric levels, and improved tissue oxygen utilization. This process also stabilizes the acid-base balance and reduces susceptibility to altitude sickness. However, it does require time, which is not always something that is available in the case of rapid deployments. Operational data reinforces these methods that the Joint Force Training evidence has backed up. Joint Force Training exercises consistently shows that troops who are native to or have long-term adaptations to extreme environments outperform newly deployed units. They demonstrate superior endurance, faster recovery, and more stable cognitive performance. This gap highlights a critical reality that adaptation is not just about exposure, it's about duration and depth. So for this case, we're looking at the Arctic training with Norway and our NATO allies. This is conducted through exercises such as extreme cold response. Multinational NATO has integrated into these extreme cold environments to train different troops for different tasks. The Norwegian forces specifically demonstrate superior cold endurance, movement efficiency on snow and ice, and the energy conservation in extreme cold. Long-term environmental exposure and doctrine-based training has led to an enhancement of our cold adaptation compared to short-term foreign training. Another example of joint force training is with high-altitude groups up in the Himalayas. Joint operations, including the Nepalese Gurkhas in low oxygen environment, has significantly impacted the performance of our troops. Indigenous and high-altitude troops have better oxygen utilization efficiency, better endurance, and stability during exposure to extreme environments. Lowland troops require the acclimatization that can take weeks, and when combined with these groups, can be expected to increase their VO2 max and their cognitive performance in these extreme circumstances. This demonstrates that physiological advantages are linked to long-term environmental and genetic adaptations. High heat environments, specifically in the sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East, do require other physiological changes to happen. Some things to closely monitor are increased core temperature and dehydration or cardiovascular change. Observing for rapid decline of endurance, impaired cognitive function, and increased fatigue rates can help catch the rapid deterioration before it actually begins. Heat acclimatizing protocols such as hydration and electrolyte consumption with gradual exposure to the heat over 1 to 2 weeks is very critical for productive performance in these environments. There are limitations to our short-term adaptations, specifically incomplete physiological adaptations. Only partial improvement in oxygen delivery in the body and endurance does not fully replicate what can be done in long-term acclimatization. Cognitive vulnerability is also very prevalent. Persistently impaired under hypoxia can lead to harder times making quick decisions. Reaction times are affected, and decisions are not often thought well through in that hypoxic situation. There's also an individual variability, unequal responses to identical training plans because of one's environmental influences and genetic influences also must be considered. Time and sustainability constraints. These adaptations often require repeated exposure and may diminish without proper maintenance. So making sure you are properly preparing a unit for a specific task is critical to the timeline and critical to their performance. Environmental complexity is another big piece of the puzzle that we look through here. Trainings often isolate single stressors, but the real-world environment often combines most of these stressors together. Hypoxia, extreme environments, physical and cognitive stressors often come together, and it's important that we address the combined stress that all of these things place on the body. Genetic variabilities in the adaptations. There are different things that happen in the body that can control how a specific individual adapts. The HIF pathway regulates the cellular response to low oxygen and can look differently and express differently throughout different bodies. The EPO production, which controls the red blood cell synthesis, also affects performance delivery. Hemoglobin Affinity determines oxygen binding and release efficiency. Ventilatory response impacts sensitivity to lower oxygen, causing changes in breathing rates as well.
This leads us to a special case study to tie how genetics, behavioral modifications, and technological adaptation allows us to co-inhabit in one of the most extreme environments, such as Antarctica. However, before we begin, I want to talk a little bit about our seventh continent. So in front of us is it's an image of Antarctica that was taken April 20th, 2026. It shows the ice age concentration and its current state, while the orange border shows us the sea edge from 1981 to 2010 and how much bigger it has been in the past. 50 million years ago, Antarctica was actually attached to the tip of South America, but it was split apart due to Pangea 34 million years ago and created Drake's Passage. From then on, a cold waterfront of negative 1.8 Celsius surrounds Antarctica, and it makes it the coldest place on Earth. And through this evolution, we have learned that species had to invent something new from the old in order to adapt to the freezing cold temperatures. And one of these species is the notothenoid fish, where over millions of years of cold exposure and natural selection, they've developed an antifreeze protein, which is a mutation from the trypsinogen gene that makes their blood thin enough to not freeze over underwater. Another species is the ice fish, which has deleted the hemoglobin gene altogether, needing no blood to thrive and survive. So the Antarctic Treaty is a treaty that was enacted in 1961 for peace and scientific exploration. As you may know, Antarctica is known as the coldest place with the biggest desert, attracting over 1,000 research scientists over the summer to 250 research scientists in the winter because of its cold weather. It drops to negative 50 degrees Celsius, and that's only at the coastal region of McMurdo Station alone. So far, 7 countries claim the Antarctic territory, and the Environmental Protocol of 1998 has banned all mineral resource activities, but because this expires in 50 years, in 2048, there may be global geopolitical tension for profit on this continent and will open the doors for exploitation. Why does no one live there permanently? Well, that's because of the climatic and meteor factors. There is a phenomenon called infrasound, which inhibits less than 20 hertz frequency from winds and macrobaromes, which has the ability to vibrate internal organs such as the vestibular system and brain. For example, between 2 to 20 hertz, vertigo, dizziness, and motion sickness have been associated with vestibular disruption. And at 18 to 19 hertz, vibrations can cause resonance in the human eyeball, leading to blurred vision and hallucinations. Both of these may disrupt spatial disorientation, which can also cause anxiety and psychological issues with hallucinations. Another phenomenon is the Schumann resonance, which acts as Earth's electromagnetic field, or its heartbeat, and it correlates with the human brain waves of delta and alpha. And due to the climatic weather disruptions, these brain waves also get disrupted, and so it causes melatonin disruption, sleep disturbances, mental fog, and dysynchronosis, which is a circadian rhythm misalignment. Light also plays a factor in our circadian rhythm. So photoperiodism is the phenomenon where over the summer months, there's 24-hour sun, and then in the winter, it's total darkness. So this disrupts the central clock. And so we have a clock gene that activates and inactivates genes based on our sleep-wake cycle. The light that enters into our eyes allows us to navigate through our hypothalamus to whether or not we should activate during the wake cycle or the sleep cycle. We also have the sterile environment, microbes in Antarctica, which is very clean. Because of the clean environment, this inactivates our immune system to fight off any diseases, and it also shuts off our third brain, which is our gut-brain axis. So this leads to our peripheral clock to shut down, which is activated by hormones, neurotransmitters, food, and things like that. So with the central clock and the peripheral clock to be shut down, this disrupts our circadian rhythm and our sleep cycle. Another thing is the high elevation and cold temperatures. People who live there, like scientists, risk hypothermia and hypoxia. So there was a case study with 20 Ukrainian wintering expeditions, and what they found within the first couple weeks of living there is those who weren't weren't able to adapt. So disadaptation and dysregulation of their circadian rhythm, had higher sympathetic output, meaning a call for survival instincts to activate. They also measured their biomarkers of urinary catecholamines, and they were increased. So hormones such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine had elevated levels, meaning that they felt a sense of danger in their environment. In addition to that, they also had increased oxidative stress markers, such as higher levels of T-bars, and that is in addition due to the ozone hole. So why are we talking about scientists? Well, given that they're in extreme environments, they're actually extreme athletes. They face polar acclimatization, winter over syndromes, psychological deterioration, and cardiovascular stress if they're not taken care of. What polar acclimatization means is their ability to thermoregulate, have ability to navigate their hormones, to shift into their environment, control their metabolic rate, have a decent amount of cardiovascular remodeling for their conditions, and circadian rhythm control. There is a gene, as I mentioned previously, it's called the clock control gene. And so this pathway has the photo path and a non-photo path. It's activated through vision as well as hormones and neurotransmitters. And so if athletes aren't able to control their ability, it may be a signal of their clock gene being disrupted. Another thing is their winter over syndrome. This happens when scientists stay over in the winter, so negative 50 degrees Celsius, as well as having a lack of sunlight throughout the months. What they found was just conditions of irritability, depression, insomnia, absent-mindedness, aggressive behavior, and gastrointestinal disruption. These are things that may happen out in Antarctica. Another thing is psychological deteriorations. Being alone with 6 or 7 other scientists for like 6 months can really cause a mental toll with developing confinement and isolating symptoms. They can also be susceptible to having the polar T3 syndrome, which causes the Arctic stare. Another thing is cardiovascular stress due to the physical exertion of their job itself, the environment, and a psychological distress. It will cause their hearts to work extra hard, which is, something to look out for. We've had previous examples of natives who've lived in cold environments, such as the Inuits and the Patagonians, and how these populations can help answer some of the questions that Antarctic scientists may have problems with when adapting to cold weather. So the Inuits are actually from the North Pole, and they solved coldness through metabolic adaptation. They have 3 genes that are known to lower cholesterol and have higher insulin control because of their diet living in the North Pole, where they're surrounded by fish, and that causes them to have a higher fat diet. And that's the FADS genes, FADS1, 2, and 3. Another gene that they have is the ability to have higher brown fat adipose tissue for active non-shivering thermogenesis, and that's the WARS-S2, TBX15, UCP1, and UCP3. The Patagonians are known as the last migrants from Africa that live closest to the South Pole. And so that's South America, and they live just below enough where they're close to Antarctica. And so what they've actually done was they've solved the problem of coldness through structural and dietary patterns. Similar to the Inuits, they have a shorter stature, and that's due to the Bergman's rule, where their shorter stature is actually linked to adaptation to extreme cold, and that's through the genes of SUPT3H, CAD-M1, and RUNX2. Another difference between the natives of the North Pole versus the natives of the South America is the fat metabolism. So they have a lipoprotein metabolism that allows them to break down fats more easily, as well as LDL cholesterol regulation on their maritime diet, as opposed to utilizing higher brown fat adipose tissue in the Inuits. So these genes include the MSMO1, the SORT1, and the PSCR2, and the CELS-R2. Because of their high-fat diet, they are able to have a metabolic homeostasis due to ZNF202. And they have the MHC complex, which is the adaptation to endemic pathogens from previous colonial civilizations. So how does this apply to the adapters of the Antarctic scientists? Well, they're introduced to a new area, and so they're exposed to newer microbes. They also don't have the ability to have higher brown fat tissue, so they have to utilize clothing as a way to insulate their bodies. They also have to have a properly timed caloric surplus protocol so that they can burn energy efficiently in the colder environments. And they've developed shelters like insulated stations and wind barriers to prevent them from getting frozen to death out there. Another interesting fact about the scientists is this one gene called HIF1A, the CT genotype. This genetic variation actually predicts who adapts and who deteriorates, and this has to do with the blood chemistry. So hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha CT genotype is a heterogenic genotype that creates less efficient hypoxic response and impairs hemodynamic efficiency during increased workload. And this is the disadaptation that occurs in Antarctic environments because they're exposed to higher altitude, cold-induced vasoconstriction, and physical demands as a research scientist. So as you can see from this graph, the low end of the hemoglobin oxygen affinity is shifted to the right, which requires more oxygen to meet the same amount of hemoglobin saturation. So they require more oxygen, but in an environment where there is less oxygen available, you can see how they will have a hard time out there. So suggested survival tactics include pharmacological agents. So these are essential to address the unique physiological stressors of extreme cold, isolation, high UV exposure, which can cause symptoms like sympathetic adrenal system tension, oxidative stress, and hypoxia-related CNS changes. So these include sunscreen, vitamins, and antioxidant supplementation, melatonin for synchronosis, and iron for hypoxia, as well as other pharmacological agents in terms of medicine. Another thing that will prepare them is the hypoxic training, so sessions of using breathing air and working out with reduced oxygen content ranging from 12 to 18% under a control of blood hemoglobin oxygen saturation would help them to adapt to lower oxygen environments so that they can adapt better and perform better. This also helps to condition their iron levels, but in addition to that, supplementation also helps. So this is to help regulate HIF1A, erythropoietin pathways, oxidative stress, and cognitive deterioration under polar expeditions. A big one is controlling core body temperature. So wearing heavy insulation and carrying heavy loads, reaching up to 40% body mass, has been shown to be an effective way to increase overall core body temperature in Antarctica, which is, found in a research study where accidental heat acclimation training helped to adapt these participants in thermoregulatory efficiency. Last but not least, been great technology and infrastructures to help support our greatest discoveries. So this is the McMurdo Station. It's located by the Hunt Point Peninsula on Ross Island, which basically means that they're surrounded by encaved rock to protect them from extreme Antarctic interior cold waves by the Transantarctic Mountains. And they also have built special infrastructure to withstand extreme cold and windy conditions. They're revamping the McMurdo Station through the Ames project. And so this will help to enhance their ability to stay warm out there, as well as prolong their missions in the winter times. With this along the way can help to influence other areas of extreme conditions, such as space. And so these are our sources. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great day.
So the take-home message of this presentation is that there is no perfect human adaptation or solution that has been set, and rather there are different environments that produce different solutions to the same physiological problem. Regarding genetics and environmental adaptations, short-term adaptations can be likened to climate acclimatization, and it will never equal the phenotypes that are seen from long-term exposure and that have been presented in these ethnic groups. And regarding natural biology and technology, the indigenous ethnic groups have adapted in ways that we cannot fully replicate yet using technological and training interventions. And regarding the future around this field, integrating genetics, training, and technology will help us to predict performance, enhance adaptation, and expand human capability in extreme environments. And so our final thoughts on this topic is that in order to push the limits of human performance, we can continue to rely on nature as our guide, and we can determine if it has already provided solutions to the problems that we have among us. Thank you for watching our presentation. And these are our sources for our presentation. And thank you so much.